January 11, 1944, above the frozen skies of central Germany. 30,000 feet up, the thin air burned like ice. The sky was filled with black bursts of flak and the roaring sound of engines. Hundreds of them. German fighters climbed hard through the chaos, their pilots squinting through frost-covered canopies. Ahead of them, the sun glared off something massive. Waves of silver bombers, tight in formation, gliding like armored beasts across the sky. Flying fortresses, the Americans called them, the B-17s. Each carried up to 16 machine guns, manned by 10 men, their turrets swiveling in every direction. For months, German pilots had called them suicidal targets, impossible to attack head-on. But on this bitter January morning, something was different. Engines on the horizon stuttered. The tight formations began to break apart. A few fortresses fell behind, smoke trailing from their wings. And that's when the hunters closed in. Because in the air war over Europe, even the most powerful fortress could become a coffin, once it flew alone. When the United States entered World War II, its leaders believed in one defining weapon, the heavy bomber. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just another airplane. It was the physical expression of American air doctrine. Speed, altitude, and firepower. A machine that could defend itself, strike deep into enemy territory, and return home without fighter escort. In the early 1930s, engineers at Boeing had designed it to be unstoppable. 4 engines gave it long range. Rugged construction let it take punishment that would shred most aircraft. And bristling from its nose, sides, tail, and belly, a network of Browning .50 caliber guns turned it into a moving fortress of steel. When the B-17 first appeared over Europe in 1942, even German intelligence officers were impressed. They studied its photos, its defensive arcs, its ability to fly home on 2 engines. But frontline Luftwaffe pilots, men who had dominated the skies over France and the Soviet Union, were less impressed. They had beaten the best before. Surely they could beat this too. At first, they were wrong. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, launched small formations of B-17s against targets in occupied France and the Low Countries. The Germans were stunned by how tight the formations flew, wings nearly touching, overlapping fields of fire turning the airspace into a deadly web. When the first intercepts took place in late 1942, German pilots dove in with confidence, and many never came back. Attacks from the rear or from the sides were shredded by crossfire from 5 or 6 bombers at once. Aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Dahl began studying gun camera footage. They realized the B-17's design forced a change in tactics. A single fighter couldn't hope to bring one down alone. Instead, entire Sturmgruppen, assault groups out there, would have to dive together, overwhelming the bombers with concentrated fire. But while German tactics evolved, so did American production. By 1943, the United States was producing more than 300 B-17s per month. Squadron after squadron arrived in England, filling bases across East Anglia. Every day, the horizon over Europe grew thicker with their contrails. The bomber offensive had become a campaign of its own, the Daylight War. The Americans believed that precision bombing could cripple Germany's war machine. Factories, railways, fuel plants, aircraft works, all would be destroyed from the air. But to reach those targets, crews had to cross hundreds of miles of enemy territory, without fighter protection for most of the journey. That was the B-17's test, and it was brutal. From the German perspective, the threat felt overwhelming. The B-17's arrival signaled something larger, the industrial might of the United States taking physical shape in the sky. Every fortress shot down seemed to be replaced by 3 more. Every raid was larger than the last. German cities began to feel the weight of that endless production line. Still, Luftwaffe morale remained fierce. Pilots respected the bomber's toughness. Stories spread of fortresses flying home with entire sections of wing missing, but they also saw its weakness. When formations broke apart, or when engines failed, the flying fortress became just another slow target. And in the second half of 1943, Germany would begin to exploit that weakness with deadly precision. They built faster interceptors, heavier cannon, and specialized tactics aimed at tearing apart bomber groups before they reached their targets. The air war was turning into a duel of endurance, American production versus German defense. In the middle of it stood the B-17, a machine meant to survive the impossible, crewed by young men who often didn't. From the ground, civilians watched the contrails forming white lines across the sky. To them, it looked like an endless procession of strength. To the men inside those planes, it felt like flying straight into hell. 1 mile, one mission, one formation at a time. And as 1943 drew to a close, both sides prepared for the moment that would define the war in the air. The day when the flying fortresses would push deeper into Germany than ever before. And the Luftwaffe would throw everything it had to stop them. By mid-1943, American commanders were ready to prove their strategy once and for all. The flying fortress had shown it could defend itself in small raids. Now the goal was to strike at Germany's heart. Targets were chosen deep inside the Reich: aircraft plants at Regensburg, ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, and the Messerschmitt works that built Germany's most advanced fighters. The plan was simple in theory. Hundreds of bombers would leave England, fly in tight formations, bomb their targets, and return home. But there was one fatal problem. No fighter in the Allied arsenal could escort them all the way. P-47. Thunderbolts and Spitfires could follow the bombers only part way. Once they turned back, the fortresses were on their own. From that point on, every mission became a gamble between courage and disaster. When the first deep raids began, the Germans were ready. The Luftwaffe had reorganized its defenses. Radar chains tracked incoming formations from the North Sea to the Bavarian Alps. Fighters scrambled from dozens of airfields, climbing to meet the bombers at pre-planned interception points. The sky above Germany turned into a brutal chessboard of smoke and metal. From the ground, it looked almost beautiful. Streams of contrails weaving like white ribbons across a perfect blue sky. From inside a B-17, it looked like the end of the world. Flak exploded in thick black bursts. Fighters attacked head-on, firing 20mm and 30mm cannon shells that tore through aluminum like paper. Every minute felt like an hour. For every 100 bombers that took off, only a fraction would return untouched. The most infamous of these missions came in August and October 1943. The twin raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. They were meant to cripple Germany's aircraft industry. Instead, they nearly crippled the 8th Air Force. 60 bombers were lost on the first day alone. Nearly 600 men dead or missing. A few made it back to England with holes the size of cars ripped through their fuselage. Engines smoking, crew covered in frost and blood. Ground crews wept as they counted the losses. Yet even in defeat, the raids sent a message. American air power would not stop. Factories would be rebuilt, planes replaced, crews trained, and the formations would fly again. Because that was the American way. Build faster, build bigger, and keep going until the enemy's strength collapsed. German pilots began to feel the strain. They had shot down hundreds of bombers, but they were dying too. Each victory cost more fuel, more aircraft, more men. The B-17 was not just a machine. It was a machine designed to bleed its enemy dry. Still, the myth of the invincible fortress was fading. Inside the cockpits, American gunners saw their friends blown out of the sky. Entire formations vanished in minutes. They began to call it Black Thursday, hell over Schweinfurt, the meat grinder. The Air Force started running low on trained crews. New gunners, barely out of high school, were being sent into combat after only a few weeks of training. They learned fast, or died fast. The Germans, on the other hand, were adapting faster than ever. They began using heavily armed FW-190A-8s and BF-110s, carrying rockets and 30mm cannons, weapons designed to destroy a bomber with a few hits. They attacked from the front where the B-17 was most vulnerable. Some pilots even rammed the bombers when their ammo ran out. Each side was fighting not just for survival, but for psychological dominance. Every time a fortress fell, German radio announced it like a trophy. Every time a damaged B-17 limped back to England, it became a story of heroism. Another reason to believe the fortress was unbreakable. By the end of 1943, the balance was uncertain. The B-17 had proven its strength, but not its strategy. Flying into Germany without escorts was suicide. Yet without those missions, the air war would stall. And that's when the Americans began preparing for something new. An answer that would change the skies forever. In early 1944, Long-range escort fighters were finally ready. The P-51 Mustang, the plane that would fly farther and faster than any before. The B-17s would soon have company all the way to Berlin. But before that new era began, there was still one bitter truth to face. The Flying Fortress, with all its guns and armor, was not untouchable. It was a symbol of strength. But even symbols bleed. And for the men inside them, the next chapter would test everything they believed about courage, loyalty, and survival in the cold, thin air over Germany. To understand what happened when the B-17s began to fall behind, you have to see the air war from both sides of the glass. For the American crews, the Flying Fortress wasn't just a bomber. It was a world of metal that kept 10 men alive in the most hostile place on Earth. The crew depended on each other like a family. The pilot flew, the co-pilot checked every system, the navigator kept track of every degree, of course. Inside, the air temperature could drop to minus 40 degrees. Frost formed on guns and oxygen masks froze. They wore thick suits with electric wires running through them to stop their fingers from freezing to the triggers. Every man had his station: tail gunner, waist gunners, top turret, ball turret, radio operator, bombardier, and navigator. Every gun faced a different direction, creating a dome of firepower. That's where the name Flying Fortress came from, a ship in the sky bristling with machine guns. But even this fortress had blind spots. When German fighters dove in from above or attacked head-on, the bombers had only seconds to react. Tracer rounds zipped past windows like orange sparks. Shells punched through aluminum, sometimes setting off oxygen lines or ammunition belts. The pilots rarely saw their attackers. They just felt the plane shudder, smelled smoke, and heard the screams of wounded crewmates echoing through the intercom. The air war was personal, but you never saw a face. You fought shadows. For the German fighter pilots, those shadows had a sound: the deep, steady drone of 4 Wright Cyclone engines. They could hear it before they saw anything, a low thunder rolling through the clouds. Then, like a mirage, silver dots appeared on the horizon. As they got closer, the dots turned into walls of bombers flying so tight you could almost walk across their wings. The Luftwaffe called them Luftschlachtschiffe, air battleships. Every one of them could spit fire in every direction. A frontal attack meant flying straight into a wall of 50 caliber bullets. But if you hesitated, the bombers would reach your city, your factory, your home. So German pilots did what they had to. They flew head-on, squeezing the triggers at full throttle. They fired 20mm cannons, launched rockets, anything that could punch through the B-17's thick skin. Sometimes they flew so close the shockwave from exploding bombers shook their own planes. A few didn't make it out. Behind those attacks were men with names and faces: Hartmann, Raul, Gabreski's adversaries, young pilots barely in their 20s. They weren't fanatics. Most were just soldiers trying to stop the destruction raining on their homeland. They knew the B-17s weren't invincible, but they also knew every kill came at a cost. The difference between life and death often came down to seconds. German fighters would climb to 25,000 feet, fire their cannons, then dive away before the formation could react. If they lingered too long, the gunners would tear them apart. The Americans learned to keep formation no matter what. It was their shield. The tighter they flew, the more deadly they became. One gunner described it best: you didn't think about shooting someone down. You just saw a black cross appear and you fired until it disappeared. That was the reality of the air war. Men killing each other from hundreds of feet apart, both terrified, both convinced they were defending something worth dying for. By 1944, this deadly rhythm had become routine. Every morning, the bombers took off from England. Every morning, German radar stations picked them up and scrambled fighters to intercept. Every day, the same dance of death played out in the cold sky. Yet beneath the tactics and technology, there was something else: respect. Both sides began to understand what kind of courage it took to fly those missions. When a B-17 limped home trailing smoke, even the Germans sometimes held their fire. They knew the men inside had already been through hell. That respect didn't stop the killing, but it added a strange kind of honor to the skies. It was no longer just a fight between machines. It was a battle between wills. American crews believed their planes were unbeatable. German pilots believed no machine could survive against skill and determination. Both were right, and both were wrong. because soon the skies would prove that even the most heavily armed fortress could be hunted down, and that the pilots who thought they were safe behind 16 guns would soon learn the meaning of isolation. That's where the story turns, to the moment the formations break. The engines fail and one bomber starts to drift behind. By 1944, the flying fortress was more than a weapon. It was an idea that technology, courage, and teamwork could outlast fear. But the longer the war went on, the more that idea began to crack under pressure. Every mission demanded total focus. Formations had to stay perfectly tight, no gaps, no panic. If one bomber drifted out of place, it weakened the whole defense. And in that single weakness, the Luftwaffe saw opportunity. German aces learned to spot the signs. The slow climbing bomber, the trail of smoke, the damaged tail rudder struggling to hold formation. They didn't attack the strong. They hunted the weak. One fortress falling behind was all it took to turn order into chaos. Inside those bombers, fatigue was constant. Some crews had flown 20 or more missions. They slept in cold barracks, ate little, and carried the weight of knowing that half their squadron might not return. You could hear it in their voices before takeoff, that quiet, distant tone of men who had seen too much sky. The worst fear wasn't death. It was isolation. When your formation moved on and you were left behind, the air around you felt huge and empty. Every sound, the wind, the creak of the fuselage, the soft hum of engines, reminded you that you were now prey. German fighters circled like wolves, waiting for the perfect angle. Technically, the B-17 was built to survive. Its armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks were cutting edge for the time. Crews told stories of planes limping home with engines gone, tails shredded, holes the size of fists through the wings. Some even landed with half a tail or missing parts of the fuselage. To the engineers, this was proof of design genius. To the men who flew them, it was proof of how close death always was. The German pilots were learning too. They started forming Sturmgruppen, assault wings made of heavily armored Fu-190s, designed specifically to break bomber formations. They flew directly into the defensive gunfire, taking hits just to get close enough to fire their cannons. Some even flew in formation themselves, attacking in groups to overwhelm the bomber's defenses. The B-17's firepower, once its greatest strength, was slowly becoming its weakness. Each gun meant weight. Each gunner needed ammunition, armor, and oxygen. To stay in the air longer, the fortresses had to shed fuel or payload. That meant smaller bomb loads and shorter range. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was building faster, more powerful interceptors. Bf-109 G6s, FW-190A8s, even early jet prototypes. They didn't need to outlast the bombers. They just needed to reach them, attack, and survive the escape dive. For German command, the mission was simple: destroy the bombers before they destroyed Germany's heartland. As the air war evolved, so did its psychology. American crews began to doubt the old propaganda, the stories of invincible flying fortresses. They saw too many empty bunks each night. They watched too many names erased from duty rosters. One waist gunner later said, "You didn't think about heroism. You just wanted to make it to 25 missions and go home." 25 mission. That was the goal that earned a ticket back to the States. Few ever reached it. On the German side, morale was just as fragile. Every mission drained fuel reserves they could no longer replace. Every new American raid meant factories rebuilt under the bombs they couldn't stop. Even victory began to feel hollow. One Luftwaffe ace admitted, "For every bomber we shot down, 10 more came the next day." The balance of power was shifting, but not yet visible in the clouds. Every confrontation was still brutal, personal, and close range. Tracer lines crossed in the air like fire-lit threads. The sky, once a place of open freedom, had become a narrow cage filled with steel and noise. In those moments, the myth of invincibility died. The B-17's 16 guns didn't make it immortal. They just gave the men inside a few more seconds to fight back before gravity took hold. Some fortresses managed to make it home on 2 engines. Others crashed into the English Channel. Their crews never found. The ones that landed safely carried the scars of every battle in their dented wings and torn flags. What remained was endurance, and the quiet understanding that bravery alone wouldn't win the war in the air. Technology had reached its limit. Human stamina was the only thing left. But everything was about to change again, because in early 1944, the The Americans would send their bombers deeper than ever, escorted by the sleek long-range P-51 Mustangs. And on those first missions, something happened that no one expected. The flying fortresses, proud symbols of American might, would finally face a moment when their guns, courage and formation couldn't save them. A single mistake, an engine hit, a tail fire, a turn too wide, and the sky would belong to someone else. The stage was set for the turning point, when the hunters and the hunted would trade places high above Germany. January 11, 1944. The mission was called Operation Argument, part of the Allied plan to cripple the Luftwaffe before the D-Day landings. The target: aircraft factories near Oschersleben, Halberstadt, and Brunswick, the heart of German fighter production. The Americans were sending hundreds of B-17s deep into central Germany. It was cold enough to freeze breath inside oxygen masks. At 30,000 feet, sunlight glared off the bombers' silver wings like blades. Engines hummed in perfect formation, 4 rows deep, dozens wide. It looked unstoppable. But every man inside those bombers knew what was waiting beyond the clouds. As they crossed into German airspace, radar stations lit up across the countryside. Sirens wailed from Bremen to Leipzig. German ground controllers barked into radios. Feindverband! 200 plus. Höhe 8,000. Enemy formation, altitude 8,000 meters. Within minutes, hundreds of fighters scrambled into the sky. Bf-109s, for 190s, and twin-engine Bf-110s armed with 30mm cannons and rockets. At first, the Americans held formation perfectly. Machine guns scanned the horizon, turrets rotating in mechanical rhythm. They had done this before, hundreds of times. But this time something felt off. The weather was turning. Thick banks of cloud rolled in from the north, scattering sunlight and breaking visibility. The bombers had to climb higher, and formations began to stretch thin. At that moment, one small mistake, one misjudged speed or altitude, could tear the entire group apart. The German fighters struck fast. They dove through the clouds like hawks through fog. From the front, they fired in short bursts, 20mm shells exploding across the bomber noses. From above, they raked the wings and engines. Every few seconds, another bomber flared an orange light. A fuel tank hit, an engine gone. One B-17, Hell's Angel Fu, took 3 direct hits in its left wing. The engine caught fire, spinning blades scattering metal fragments into the sky. The crew jettisoned their bombs, trying to lighten the load, but the plane was losing altitude fast. The pilot, frozen fingers gripping the controls, called out to the crew, "Hold formation. Don't fall behind." But gravity didn't listen. The plane dropped 100 feet, then 200, then more. In the air war, that was enough to seal your fate. German eyes caught it immediately. A silver fortress drifting lower, engines struggling. "Da der Nachzügler," shouted a Luftwaffe pilot. "There, the straggler." In less than a minute, 5 German fighters turned toward it. The fortress's 16 guns opened fire, tracer rounds flashing like fireworks. The gunners screamed coordinates, each man firing at a shadow moving at 400 miles per hour. They hit one. A 190 burst into flames, but the others kept coming. From the ground, villagers saw the lonely bomber trying to climb back up, smoke trailing from its wings, surrounded by dots of black and silver. Inside, the tail gunner was already dead. The radio operator tried to send a distress call, but the antenna was gone. The intercom buzzed with static and shouts. Then a cannon shell exploded near the cockpit, tearing through the windshield. The plane shuddered. A wing tore loose. For a brief, silent moment, it looked as if the fortress was floating, weightless, graceful, and then it broke apart in midair. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers in the sky. Only a few opened. The rest fell into the winter clouds below. This scene wasn't rare. It was happening all across the formation. Each time a bomber was hit, it slowed, drifted, and became prey. The formations that once seemed like solid walls of steel now looked fractured, pieces of a giant machine coming undone. German pilots were shocked, not by the losses they inflicted, but by how quickly the American formations broke once the weather and altitude turned against them. They had always feared the fortress's firepower, but now they saw something else. Limits. By noon, the sky over Oschersleben was a nightmare. Flak bursts filled the air. Smoke trails twisted in every direction, and the once proud formations had scattered into chaos. For the men in the air, it felt endless. Hours of noise, pain, and burning light. Back in England, radio operators waited for the returning squadrons. When the first fortresses appeared on the horizon that afternoon, the ground crews knew something was wrong. There were too few. Whole groups were missing. Out of over 600 bombers sent out that day, nearly 60 never returned. The mission had crippled parts of German industry, but it had also shown something no one wanted to admit. Even 16 guns couldn't protect a fortress once it was alone. And for the men who survived, that realization would haunt every mission afterward. They had seen their invincible fortress stripped of its legend, and the Luftwaffe, battered but alive, had tasted victory once more. But the story didn't end there. Because amid the smoke and destruction, both sides were about to unleash new weapons, and with them, a shift that would decide the air war's future. The smoke from the January raids drifted across Germany for hours. On the ground, wreckage was still falling. Twisted engines, scraps of aluminum, half-burned parachutes caught in trees. Farmers stared at the debris scattered across frozen fields, each piece marked with the same bold white star. At first, the Luftwaffe believed they had won a major victory. They had destroyed nearly 60 bombers and hundreds of American airmen in a single day. To them, it was proof that Germany still controlled its own skies. Fighter pilots celebrated, mechanics cheered, and propaganda officers rushed to photograph the wrecks. But when the reports reached higher command, the tone shifted. Each kill had cost Germany more fuel, more engines, more pilots, resources they could no longer replace. And the factories they fought so hard to defend were burning. The raids had hit targets vital to the German air industry. Production lines slowed, repair depots were wrecked, and spare parts became scarce. Meanwhile, the Americans were not retreating. Just days after the losses, fresh bombers were already lined up on runways in England. New crews arrived daily, teenagers from Kansas, Ohio, New York, ready to take the places of those who didn't return. To Germany, it felt endless. For every fortress shot down, 2 more appeared in its place. But the Americans were learning too. They knew they couldn't keep sending bombers without fighter cover. The B-17's defensive wall was strong but not indestructible. So the 8th Air Force made a bold decision to combine its heavy bombers with a new escort capable of following them all the way to the target and back. That escort was the P-51 Mustang. It was sleek, fast, and carried drop tanks that doubled its range. Armed with 650 caliber guns, it could climb higher than anything the Luftwaffe had. For the first time, American bombers wouldn't have to face the German fighters alone. In February 1944, the skies above Germany changed. On the next major raids, P-51s flew alongside the B-17s, small at first, then in growing numbers. When German fighters rose to intercept, the Mustangs dove down on them before they could reach the formations. What followed was a massacre, not of bombers, but of interceptors. The Luftwaffe's veteran aces, men who had survived since the Battle of Britain, suddenly found themselves hunted. Fuel shortages meant they could fly only 1 or 2 sorties a day. Younger pilots, barely trained, were sent up in outdated aircraft. They were brave, but hopelessly outmatched. The Americans called it Big Week. 6 days of relentless bombing in February 1944. Factories in Leipzig, Augsburg, and Stuttgart went up in flames. The Luftwaffe fought hard, shooting down dozens of bombers, but by the end of the week they had lost nearly 1/3 of their fighters. The sky, once a fortress of German defense, now belonged to the Allies. The turning point had arrived. Inside the bombers, the mood changed too. Crews who had once flown terrified began to see fighters below them, their fighters, cutting through the clouds to protect them. The sound of machine guns was still constant, but now there was something else in the air. Hope. The Germans tried new tactics. They equipped some FW-190s with heavy armor, flying directly into formations to break them apart. Others carried rockets to attack from beyond the bomber's range. But each attempt came too late, and each success cost more than it gained. In a single month, Luftwaffe fighter losses outnumbered new recruits. The once proud Jagdgeschwader squadrons, like JG-1 and JG-26, were now flying with fewer than half their original men. The Germans still fought with skill, but the sky was slipping away from them. For the B-17 crews, the shift was clear every time they took off. They still lost friends, still saw fortresses burning in the air, but the balance of fear had changed. They no longer felt like victims flying into a storm. They were part of something bigger now, a force that was finally breaking Germany's ability to fight back, and yet even victory carried a price. The surviving airmen were haunted by what they'd seen, the endless stream of smoke trails, the parachutes that never opened, the faces missing from breakfast the next morning. One pilot described it simply: "We won the air, but it felt like we lost everything getting there." By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was shattered. The factories that built its fighters lay in ruins. Its best pilots were dead or exhausted. And the same flying fortresses that once fell behind, helpless and burning, were now leading the way, paving the sky for D-Day and the final push into Germany. The myth of the invincible bomber was gone, replaced by something real: endurance, teamwork, and sacrifice. The B-17s were no longer just machines of war. They were symbols of how far human courage could be pushed before breaking. The air war had turned. And with it, so had the war itself. By mid-1944, the skies over Europe told a different story. Once German contrails had filled the upper air, crossing, diving, attacking in tight formations. Now the sky was quieter. What few enemy planes appeared were usually young, nervous pilots flying old patched-up aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the deadliest air force in the world, was bleeding out. Fuel was scarce. Factories were rubble and experienced men were gone. Those still alive flew 2, sometimes 3 missions a day, returning to bases that no longer had roofs. The runways were cratered. Mechanics worked under canvas tents. And still orders came: defend the Reich, but defend it with what? By the summer of 1944, Germany's air power was collapsing faster than anyone in Berlin would admit. For every bomber they destroyed, the Americans built 10 more. For every German pilot lost, the U.S. trained dozens. Even the once invincible Me-109s and FW-190s were being hunted by Mustangs before they could climb to attack altitude. And yet, on the ground, civilians still looked up in disbelief. Every day, new waves of silver bombers passed overhead, hundreds at a time, stretching from horizon to horizon. To them, the sky looked like a highway of death, carrying destruction deeper and deeper into Germany. Cities like Hamburg, Berlin, and Dresden were turned into infernos. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. The bombers, once fighting for survival, now moved with confidence and terrifying power. What started as desperate raids had become systematic annihilation. Inside those bombers, though, there was little celebration. The faces were older now, even on young men. They had seen too much. They carried photos of crews who hadn't made it, names scratched into the metal of gun mounts, lucky charms that didn't always work. Every mission still took its toll. Even with air superiority, every man knew his number could come up next. The roar of engines, the oxygen masks, the sound of flak bursting outside. It was all routine now, but it never got easier. One gunner recalled, "We stopped thinking about winning. We just thought about making it home." Back in Germany, the Luftwaffe's leadership was trapped in denial. They placed their hopes in new wonder weapons. Jet fighters like the Me-262, guided bombs, and miracle projects that came too late. The factories that were supposed to build them were already gone. The pilots meant to fly them had no training fuel left. By autumn, the air war had become one-sided. American bombers roamed over German territory almost unchallenged. Fighter groups swept the skies clean before each major operation. The once deadly German anti-aircraft guns, the flak towers, kept firing, but even those couldn't stop the tide. In the mess halls of the 8th Air Force, the tone was mixed. Men cheered the news of fewer enemy fighters, but no one really smiled. Too many had empty seats at their tables, and every time a mission was briefed, there was still that silence, the unspoken fear that today might be the day you didn't come back. The Flying Fortress had proven itself, not as invincible, but as relentless. Its 16 guns couldn't save every man, but its strength lay in something deeper: persistence. Again and again, the B-17 crews climbed into those freezing altitudes, knowing exactly what waited for them. And they did it anyway. Down below, the people of Germany looked up and understood what that meant. The endless rumble above wasn't just noise anymore. It was the sound of defeat closing in. Every column of smoke, every distant explosion, told them that the war had turned against them for good. The Luftwaffe that once terrorized Europe was now a ghost. And the same bombers it once tried to destroy were now writing the final chapter of the air war. In fire, steel, and unshakable will. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the airfields were quiet again, but the silence felt strange. On both sides of the front, pilots walked among burned-out aircraft, wings torn apart, engines seized with soot and oil. The air war, once roaring with life, now ended in stillness. Across England, rows of B-17s sat lined up in perfect formation, waiting not for battle, but for disposal. Some were to be scrapped, melted into aluminum for peacetime industry. Others were left to rust at the edges of runways, their bullet holes patched with dull steel, names still painted on their noses. Memphis Belle, Shoo Shoo Baby, Heaven Sent. Machines that had once carried 10 men into hell now had no purpose. For the crews who survived, life never fully returned to normal. They went home with medals, but also with heavy memories. The smell of burning fuel, the sound of flak, the sudden flash of an exploding plane beside them. Those things didn't fade. Many never spoke of it again. In Germany, the young men who had flown against them faced a different kind of silence. The Luftwaffe's survivors walked through the ruins of cities they had sworn to protect. They saw the faces of civilians and women, children, the old, and realized that their war in the air had been fought over their own homes. Some were bitter. Others were simply empty. Historians later called it the most brutal aerial campaign in history, fought not for ground or glory, but for control of the sky itself. Between 1942 and 1945, over 120,000 airmen of the U.S. 8th Air Force became casualties. Half never came back. Germany lost nearly all of its trained fighter pilots. The air war devoured an entire generation of flyers. But inside that destruction lay the foundation for something new. The lessons learned in those cold skies would shape the future of aviation. Jet engines, radar, long-range bombing, precision targeting. The world entered the jet age carrying the ghosts of the propeller war. The B-17, the flying fortress, remained its most enduring image. A machine that symbolized courage and loss in equal measure. It had been called unstoppable, indestructible, but its true legacy wasn't its armor or its guns. It was the men inside it. They weren't superhuman. They were scared, cold, and tired, but they climbed back in again and again until the job was done. And on the other side, the German pilots who once stared in disbelief at these gun-bristling giants learned a similar truth, that even courage could be crushed by numbers, and skill could not replace fuel or time. The flying fortress broke their ranks, but it also broke hearts. It changed the way the world saw war, from the skies down. The thunder of its engines would fade, but its shadow stayed long after the smoke cleared, and long after both sides stopped fighting. The B-17 Flying Fortress was never truly invincible. Its 16 guns, its thick aluminum skin, its relentless formations, all of it could be pierced, torn apart, and scattered by the cold mathematics of war. Yet in its imperfections it revealed something far greater, the measure of human endurance. Inside each fortress, 10 men faced the unimaginable, freezing altitudes, roaring engines, deadly flak, and fighters circling like predators. They trusted each other with their lives, minute by minute, mission by mission. And in that trust, the Flying Fortress became more than a bomber. It became a symbol of courage under fire, a testament to teamwork and sheer willpower. Across the skies of Europe, German pilots once feared these flying machines. They respected them, despised them, and ultimately were forced to adapt to survive against them. Their victories came at a cost that only hindsight could reveal. The air war, with its relentless bombing and staggering losses, reshaped not only the outcome of the conflict but the lives of all who fought above it. Technologically, the B-17 accelerated the evolution of aviation. It demanded long-range escorts, improved radar, stronger engines, and tactics that would influence generations of air combat. The lessons learned in freezing skies over Germany would echo through the jet age, shaping air strategy for decades. Yet beyond strategy and technology, the Flying Fortress remains a human story. It is the story of fear transformed into resolve, of ordinary men performing extraordinary acts under impossible conditions. It is a story of survival, sacrifice, and the invisible bonds forged between crews staring death in the face. In the end, the Flying Fortress was not invincible because of metal or firepower. It was invincible because of those who climbed aboard, knowing the risks yet pressing forward anyway. Its legacy is not just measured in missions flown or factories destroyed, but in the courage, endurance, and resilience it demanded from a generation. And as the engines quieted and the smoke faded, the world remembered. History is not shaped by machines alone, but by the humans who dare to fly them, even when the odds are impossible. The flying fortress fell behind. It burned, it broke, and yet in doing so, it soared far beyond the skies it once patrolled.